The fourth key pathway to understanding how the brain really learns and can increase its capacity to achieve at high levels academically is to remember that there are 4 lobes of the brain. And if you like to learn this with me, you might want to grab your own head to really get this into your body-brain system. Everyone please grab the front of your own head, please. You know, the sort of students that Dr. Wilson and I are usually working with. Right here we have the prefrontal lobes. Now the prefrontal lobes are absolutely critical in the learning process. Now these are often the last part of the brain to develop, and it often doesn't fully develop until the teens or even 20s. So what does this mean to us in the real world? For example, have you ever tried to say to middle schoolers or high school kids, think about the future? Show me their expression when you ask them to think about the future. They'll often give you a blank expression. One of the reasons is that these frontal lobes, these prefrontal lobes, are critical for planning and seeing the future, putting plans into place for long-term learning and execution. The other thing the prefrontal lobes are very important for is to stop doing things that don't make any sense. We often describe these as being the brakes. So if you think of the prefrontal lobe as being the area for the CEO, it runs the executive functions, it helps for planning, decision making, and judgment. It's also the area that is very much involved in making sure that we can avoid going for the short-term benefit rather than pursuing the long-term benefit. What do I mean by this? There was a wonderful test done called the marshmallow test, and they gave a group of students the opportunity to get 2 marshmallows if they could resist the temptation for eating 1 marshmallow. So just imagine this scenario. There's a little student, they go into a room, and there's a plate, and on that plate is a marshmallow. And the students came in one by one to see if they could avoid the short-term temptation of grabbing the 1 marshmallow. And this is very much a front brain activity. And some of the kids have some really amazing strategies. One kid who was very auditory was kind of singing to himself to kind of block off from the temptation of eating the marshmallow. Another student who was more visual was kind of covering their eyes like this. And they resisted the temptation of that short-term benefit of the 1 marshmallow. And then another kid walked in the room, and as soon as he saw it, his frontal lobes weren't working really well. He just grabbed that marshmallow and ate it right away. Now, this exercise is a very good predictor about success over time. Those people who are able to avoid the short-term gratification and who instead can invest in long-term plans that really bring a high yield tend to do better in school and in life. So this frontal lobe is very much the CEO of your brain. Now please grab the side of your head here and say temporal lobes. Now your temporal lobes tends to be the area of your brain that's very much involved with storing information. The way it works is information comes in through your senses. It connects with areas of the brain, for example, the hippocampus, which is kind of the indexing system. Then if the brain thinks it's important, it files it away in the temporal lobes. The reason why it's so important to consider these temporal lobes as an educator is to understand all the information that your students have learned is influenced by these temporal lobes. If you think of it as kind of the Rolodex, the storage area for all the information that your students arrive at school with. What does this mean for you in the classroom? If you're reading a story and it makes no sense to your students, it's often because they don't have sufficient references stored in their temporal lobes to really make sense of the story. One application of this is we were working with one group of kids, and the teacher was telling the story about sitting out on a patio and talking to the family. Now, if you did not have the word patio stored in your temporal lobes, this story would make absolutely no sense. So the temporal lobes are involved in storing and retrieving key areas of information. So think of this as kind of like your database. Now grab the top of your head, please. Top of your head here is the motor cortex, or your parietal lobe. This area of the brain is involved in movement and in speech. And if you'll notice that Often when some people speak, they have a lot of hand gestures. The reason for that is that the motor cortex in the parietal lobe is very close to the areas involved in speech. One of the jokes in our family where I had a grandfather who loved to talk with his hands was if you asked him to sit on his hands, he could never speak. One of the reasons is that these systems are so closely linked. So the parietal lobe is involved very much in movement and motor activities. Now please grab the back of your brain here and say occipital lobe. Now your occipital lobe is really deeply involved with visual processing for your brain. And research suggests that this visual processing area is absolutely critical for success. And let's do an experiment right now. Right now, think about how many windows you have in your house at home. And as you do that, just count how many windows that you have. Now, for some people, they will tend to look up to switch on the occipital lobe. And some of you probably just did a virtual voyage around your home, looking up and thinking about the different windows you had in your house at home. Now, the power of this occipital lobe is that the brain seems to have an almost limitless potential for storing information that it sees visually. In fact, one research study found that those people who were showed hundreds of slides, when a few days later they were shown a number of slides again, people could recognize with 90% plus accuracy what the original slides were. So what does that mean? That means that the brain, shown the slides, was able to store them, and when shown similar slides later on, was able to precisely identify what ones had been seen before. So the occipital lobe is such a critical part of the learning process. So what does this mean for us as a learner and as a teacher? As a teacher, it means all the things that you're doing right now to make your teaching much more visual is probably really helping your students learn at high levels. So what are some practical applications of this? Use graphics, use pictures, use mind maps or graphic organizers to really get this occipital lobe in the brain working at a highly effective level in your students. So let's just review those four lobes. We have the prefrontal lobe right here. That's the CEO of the brain. We have the temporal lobes that are very much involved in storing information inside the brain. We have the motor cortex up here with the parietal lobe. And we have the occipital lobe right back here, which is involved in visual processing. So now let's pause and reflect about ways in which you might be able to adjust your teaching and instruction to meet the needs of these different lobes of the brain.